took that opportunity to get the same shots in the same way that they did with Zohran when he was like, my aunt was afraid to wear her hijab on the subway after 9/11, being like, oh, yeah, that's the real victim of 9/11. Your aunt getting bad looks on the subway. All right. Let's move on from this and look at the MSNBC exclusive. Zohran Mamdani responds to GD.
Zohran Mamdani continues to lead in every single poll, with victory almost assured. It has prompted Islamophobic attacks against the Muslim candidate. And it is not just Republicans, to be clear. It's also coming from New York City Mayor Eric Adams and former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Here's what Mamdani said in response to these attacks.
We stand on the precipice of an election, but that is not what today is about. We know that in less than 2 weeks, we will say goodbye to a disgraced former governor and our current indicted mayor. The bigger question is whether we are willing to say goodbye to something much larger than either of these two men. It is whether we are willing to say goodbye to anti-Muslim sentiment that has grown so endemic in our city that when we hear it, we know not whether the words were spoken by a Republican or a Democrat.
I spoke to Zohran Mamdani earlier today for an exclusive interview about these Islamophobic attacks. Here's what he had to say. You know, for someone who's been following this race very closely and has seen the level of attacks that have been leveled against you, you know, at some point they called you Marxist, they've called you socialist, they've called you communist, they've made fun of the way you eat with your hands, make fun when you eat with forks and knives. They've called you privileged. But it seems like over the last couple of weeks, and there have been a lot of Islamophobic attacks, but in the last couple of weeks, there's been a surge of Islamophobic rhetoric against you. And it's not new, but I'm wondering why you decided to address it now. Why did you decide to speak out against it so forcefully now?
You know, when I took a step back and listened to what was being said, outside of a question of electoral politics, outside of the question of the election, but just to the fact that major candidate for mayor in the Republican Party is slandering me as the first Muslim candidate on the verge of becoming the mayor of the city, as someone who supported global jihad. When I listened to a former governor and Andrew Cuomo laugh and agree when a radio show host said that I would cheer another 9/11, when I listened to the current mayor of this city explaining his decision to endorse Andrew Cuomo as a decision to ensure that New York City does not become Europe, that we do not leave it to violent extremists who burn churches in Nigeria. When I listen to all of this and then turn on TV and see ads that have the words of jihad on top of my face that not only mock the way that I eat, but are all intended to terrify New Yorkers as to the prospect of having a Muslim mayor, I decided that it was simply too much. It was too much to think of these as the acts of desperate men looking to salvage the little power that they still had. It was, in fact, a reflection of Islamophobia within our political system that has become so endemic that when we hear it, we do not know from which party it comes. We just know that it is a fact of life in our city's politics.
You addressed this yesterday in the speech that you gave at the Islamic Cultural Center, and I want to just quote a part of it. You said, "To be Muslim in New York is to expect indignity, but indignity does not make us distinct. There are many New Yorkers who face it. It is the tolerance of that indignity that does." To go back to your first point, how has that indignity been normalized in America by the politicians, by the media, and by the way that you're seeing it now?
You just look at what is tolerated. It's not a question of what is said, it's what is tolerated. And the fact some of the most prominent politicians in this country, and to hear these words, you know, whether it's the words of Republican congresspeople who are openly calling for me to be denaturalized and deported, whether the words of a city council person here in New York City selling T-shirts to profit off of a call for my deportation, and knowing that, in fact, this is but a glimpse into reality for Muslims across the city each and every day. And while they don't have the luxury of being the next mayor of this city, being a Democratic nominee for that position, they continue to face this, and they're not extended that same kind of solidarity. And I think often about Toni Morrison She said that the function is distraction. And I think that that is true. So much of the unabashed bigotry we've seen in the last few days, whether from Curtis Lewa, Andrew Cuomo, Eric Adams, is a reflection of their own recognition that they do not have a plan to make the most expensive city in America affordable, or that their plan is in fact to make it more expensive. But Toni Morrison also said, I insist on being shocked. I refuse to accept that which would shock the conscience. And I too have oscillated between both of these quotes, the importance of running a campaign that speaks to each.
There's the balance. There's the balance that I've been trying to talk about. If you make the major point in your campaign, every moment that you spend explaining to Americans as a racialized point of attack is a moment where you could be explaining to them what you will do for them. That's the biggest issue with these lines of attack. That's why they're so successful, because on the one hand, if you don't address it, then it becomes the norm. At some point, you have to go, all right, enough, dude. I have all this social capital. I'm going to expend some of it to address this thing that doesn't just harm me, but other New Yorkers as well. Right? That's it. That is the reality that every person of some kind of marginalized background has to go through, whether they are public advocates or whether they are running a campaign, whether they are a candidate that wants to get elected to a position of power. It sucks. If he had done so early on, I suspect that it would have killed his campaign, especially with the little name recognition that he had. But now that he's actually developed a strong base, now he has more social capital that he could potentially burn in this process. Because there will be, no matter what happens, there will be people who hear him put his foot down on this issue and go, this is woke. This is woke rad lib shit. This is, he's just too thin-skinned. I don't really like that at all. And they won't see it for what it is. They won't even realize that Andrew Cuomo is redirecting the attention away back to his background and trying to cynically present him as like a scary threat. But the real thing Andrew Cuomo and many others fear is not only his position on Israel, but also his policies that will improve the lives of everyday New Yorkers. Okay? It's a concern that I also have to deal with on a daily basis as an advocate, right? It's just something that I also have to deal with all the time. And even when I do mention it, as I have with the Zohran moment, right? There were plenty of people who spent the last 2 years calling me ISIS-style fundamentalist Muslim anti-Semitic. Took that opportunity to get the same shots in the same way that they did with Zohran when he was like, my aunt was afraid to wear her hijab on the subway after 9/11, being like, oh, yeah, that's the real victim of 9/11. Your aunt getting bad looks on the subway.
Every New Yorker's needs, and also a recognition of the fact that if we do not allow ourselves to be shocked by this kind of, then we are in fact accepting it as a fact of life, and that is something that I will never accept.
Why do you think they want to pit that fear into everyone? Why do you think they want to try to unleash a fear into how Muslims are in the city? I mean, when you think about it, J.D. Vance even took a swipe at you. The Vice President of the United States took a swipe, and we have the tweet where he basically mocked the mention. You yesterday mentioned in your comments your aunt, and he took a swipe at it, saying, according to Zohran, the real victim of 9/11 was his auntie who got some allegedly bad looks, and completely marginalizing the experience of Muslim Americans in a post 9/11 America.
I mean, this is all the Republican.
Like, remember what I said when I first listened to what he had to say. It's like Muslim New Yorkers were just as traumatized as Christian New Yorkers were, as Jewish New Yorkers were, as New Yorkers of every different background on 9. They were traumatized in the same way that New Yorkers were, right? Because that's what they are. They're New Yorkers, regardless of their religious background. And then on top of that, they were additionally traumatized by being presented as the villain. Because everyone always talks about how unified America was in the aftermath of 9/11 and how wonderful it was. But there was one group of Americans that were immediately presented as the villain. So much so that even George W. Bush, who is responsible for a metric ton of death and chaos in the region with his, had to come out immediately after 9/11 and be like, no, guys, we're unified. Like, Muslim Americans are American too. I remember. Now, obviously, that message at the domestic level was then accompanied by unimaginable expansion of the surveillance state, specifically directed against Muslims who were denied due process on U.S. soil and were black bagged and kidnapped off the streets after being mass surveilled and sent to Guantanamo Bay, sometimes with no opportunity to even make a case for why this was ridiculous, unjustifiable, cruel. So they were doubly traumatized. First, because they were in the city when an act of terror took place, and then traumatized once again because they were considered the enemy from within and saw the repercussions of state surveillance.
Party has to offer. Cheap jokes about Islamophobia so as to not have to recognize what people are living through. Attempts to pit people's humanity against each other. And I think whether it's J.D. Vance or it's Andrew Cuomo, it is the same kind of politics. It's a politics of division. The reason that I've called Andrew Cuomo Donald Trump's puppet is not just because they share the same billionaire donors. It's not just because they see themselves in each other. It's also because their vision of leading a city or a country is one where you are only able to build a constituency by pitting it against another one. And that's what we're seeing in this moment. And let's just talk about the moment we have at hand. We have a shutdown of the federal government. We have Americans across this country living in fear about rising healthcare costs, about the fact that we're going to see decimating cuts to SNAP. We have active duty military families in line for food pantries. And amidst all of this is just how much bigotry they can engage in.